Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's top story. A tale of comedy, tragedy, and one yellow family who went from cultural revolutionaries to the TV equivalent of a microwaved leftover. Yes, I'm talking about The Simpsons, the once golden child of American satire that now limps along in prime time like an aging celebrity making a surprise appearance on Dancing with the Stars. And folks, what happened here isn't just entertainment gossip. It's the autopsy of one of the greatest creative successes in television history. So grab your remote, hold on to your nostalgia, and for the love of Moe's Tavern, don't change the channel. Because by the time we're done, you'll know exactly how this masterpiece went from a rebel yell to a background hum, and you'll want to stick around. Because somewhere in this broadcast is the one detail about Homer you probably never noticed. But once you do, you'll never unsee it. Now let's begin at the beginning. And trust me, it's a very different Springfield than the one we know today. Picture this. Same family of five. Same yellow skin tone. Same three-fingered hands waving at the opening credits. And yet, these are two entirely different species of show, which used to air every night between 6 and 8 on Fox, and it may carry the name of The Simpsons. Now, it's a politely tolerated neighbor who still shows up to the barbecue but spends the whole time talking about past parties they used to throw. The reason for the confusion is surface-level similarity. You've still got Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie standing in the same living room, but under the hood, the engine's been swapped for a much cheaper model. The old show had teeth, was sharp, satirical, and it bit into the jugular of American culture and gnawed away, which means if you only drop in every now and then, you might not notice until suddenly you're halfway through an episode thinking, wait a second. Since when did Homer survive a fall from space without a scratch? And trust me, the reason that's happening is exactly what we're about to unpack in this investigation. Because the first big takeaway, and the headline you should burn into your brain, is this. There was The Simpsons. And then there was Zombie Simpsons. Two shows. Same name. One a roaring lion, the other a stuffed animal on a shelf. And if you think I'm exaggerating, stay tuned. Because in the next segment we're going to travel back to the neon-lit, big-haired, shoulder-padded 1980s to see exactly what kind of television wasteland gave. Ladies and gentlemen, before Springfield lit up our TV screens like a nuclear power plant meltdown in Sector 7G, we need to rewind to the 1980s. An era of pastel blazers, shoulder pads big enough to qualify as architectural features in a television landscape, so sugary sweet it could give you a cavity just from looking at the TV guide. The first half of the decade was ruled by soaps like Dallas and Dynasty, where the most exciting plot twists involved boardroom betrayals and someone dramatically slapping someone else across the face in slow motion. But as the decade crawled toward its final gasp, the family sitcom came back swinging. Except, plot twist, it wasn't swinging very hard. We had different strokes. Alf and Family Ties, all shows where by the end of the episode the kids learned their lesson, the parents gave a heartwarming speech, and everyone hugged it out. The families were wealthy enough to be aspirational but not so wealthy that you'd throw a brick at your TV out of jealousy. And there was nothing wrong with them if you just wanted wholesome comfort food for the brain. But let's be real. They were about as edgy as a marble. Matt Groening, the man with a sketchpad and a rebellious streak the size of Moe's beer tab, looked at this and coined a phrase for what he was seeing: the zombification of the American family. In other words, TV had turned the family into a beige, lifeless concept, smiling through every conflict like Stepford parents reading a Hallmark card. And here's the hook: that zombification was about to get bitten hard by a very different kind of zombie. Because when The Simpsons debuted on December 14, 1989, just 2 weeks before the decade closed, it wasn't just another family sitcom. It was a Molotov cocktail hurled straight into America's living room. Gone were the wise dads solving every crisis in 22 minutes. Here came a beer-bellied father figure who would sell his soul for a donut. Instead of glossing over problems, The Simpsons held them up under a fluorescent light and poked them with a stick. Poverty, depression, bullying, political corruption, all fair game. And let's not forget the delicious irony. This countercultural juggernaut was airing in primetime right after the same safe, predictable shows it was gleefully mocking. No laugh tracks, no sugarcoating, no ah moments unless they'd been strategically laced with sarcasm. The public didn't just notice, they reacted. Parents' groups were horrified, politicians clutched their pearls, and former President George H.W. Bush famously told America we should be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. That's right. A sitting president publicly feuded with a cartoon family, and instead of dialing it back, The Simpsons doubled down, because nothing boosts your counterculture street cred like getting scolded by the most powerful man in the world. Merch flew off shelves, catchphrases infiltrated schoolyards, and suddenly it was cooler to be Bart Simpson than Bart Starr. But here's why this matters. The cultural environment of the 80s wasn't just background noise. It was the setup for the punchline that was The Simpsons. And behind them was a murderer's row of writers like John Swartzwelder, John Vitti, Conan O'Brien, and David M. Stern, each bringing their own style of absurdist wit, layered gags, and plot lines that could balance slapstick with social commentary in a way that seemed effortless, though in reality it was the result of 11-hour days and 30-40 rewrites per episode. Imagine that. A joke going through more drafts than most politicians' speeches, every punchline tested, refined, and sharpened, until it could slice through a laugh track without breaking a sweat. And the beauty of this machine was that every laugh came from character. Homer wasn't funny because he slipped on a banana peel. He was funny because slipping on a banana peel perfectly fit with the man's gluttony, laziness, or blissful ignorance. Bart wasn't just a bad kid. He was a 10-year-old philosopher of chaos, waging a one-boy war against authority because deep down he knew authority deserved it. Lisa wasn't just the smart one. She was a voice of reason trapped in a town of lunatics, which made her both tragic and hilarious. And this writing discipline is why the early seasons hit like a brick of gold. It was smart without being smug, emotional without being sappy, and hilarious without being hollow. Which is why what happens next in our story is so heartbreaking. Because when you see the alchemy at work here, you realize it's not just a formula you can replicate with new names on the staff list. You can't swap out Matt Groening for some guy and expect the same magic. You can't replace Sam Simon's meticulous story architecture with let's just make Homer loud and think no one will notice. And you definitely can't hand James L. Brooks's emotional blueprint to someone who thinks pathos is a Greek island. This was lightning in a bottle, and here's the hook. Eventually, someone was going to drop the bottle, and when they did, the crack didn't just let the magic leak out. It changed the chemistry of The Simpsons forever. But before the lightning faded, the early seasons gave us some of the sharpest, most layered comedy television had ever seen. And next we're going to break down exactly how those jokes worked, and why modern sitcoms couldn't copy them even if they tried. Now folks, if you've ever wondered why classic Simpsons made you laugh so hard you nearly inhaled a potato chip, only to watch a modern episode and barely muster a polite nasal exhale, the answer is simple. Layers. And I'm not talking about the kind of layers you get on a store-bought cake. I'm talking about a 5-tier handcrafted comedy lasagna, each joke carefully stacked on the last, until the whole thing exploded into absurd perfection. Back in the golden years, the writing staff didn't just throw in a gag and move on. They worked it over like jewelers polishing a diamond, running each joke through 30 to 40 rewrites until it was as sharp as Bart's slingshot aim. Let's take one example, the legendary Bart Sells His Soul episode. Bart's on a mission to get his soul back riding his bike through the night when a street sweeper runs it over. First layer. Well, finally, a little luck. That's a gag already, irony in motion. The second layer. The street sweeper appears to have simply cleaned the bike. Third. Nope, it's destroyed. Fourth. This was an act of deliberate malice by a gleeful, psychotic street cleaner. Fifth. The sweeper plunges into a stairwell for no reason other than to hit us with a surreal kicker. That's 5 jokes in 15 seconds, each building on the one before, timed and delivered so perfectly that your brain barely has time to reset before the next punch hits. And here's the secret sauce. No laugh track. Back then, sitcoms were drowning in canned laughter, basically a neon sign flashing "This is funny" over every limp one-liner. The Simpsons didn't have it, didn't need it, and in fact couldn't have used it without ruining the pacing. That street sweeper gag, if you dropped a 5-second laugh track after the punchline, you'd kill the eerie, surreal vibe, and that atmosphere was half the joke. Without that artificial pause, the rhythm could keep firing, joke after joke, turning each scene into a rapid-fire comedy clinic. And while they were busy building those jokes, they were also doing something sitcoms rarely bothered with, making sure the humor came from the character themselves. Homer didn't trip and fall because it was slapstick humor. He tripped and fell because he was lazy, careless, or distracted by food. And that fit the internal logic of who Homer was. Bart's pranks weren't random. They were acts of rebellion shaped by his distrust of authority. Lisa's sarcasm wasn't filler. It was the coping mechanism of a genius surrounded by lunatics. This meant every laugh carried weight, because you weren't just laughing at a joke, you were laughing at them, the people you'd come to know inside and out. And here's the real kicker. They didn't just do this once in a while. They did it every episode, weaving satire, slapstick, visual gags, and emotional beats together into half-hour masterpieces. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most underappreciated reasons classic Simpsons was a laugh-generating machine was that its characters were as solid as Mr. Burns' grip on the Springfield nuclear plant, which is to say, terrifyingly consistent and not easily pried away. Every major player in Springfield was built on a foundation of clear, conflicting traits that guided their behavior like invisible strings, and no matter how absurd the plot got, those strings never snapped. Take Homer, the crown jewel of dim-witted American fatherhood. He was gluttonous, lazy, and blissfully ignorant. Yes, but he was also an emotional optimist, prone to bursts of joy and just as prone to volcanic anger. He didn't want much out of life. A cold beer, a warm couch, a little peace and quiet, and above all, he cared deeply about his family, even if he expressed it in ways that would make a marriage counselor sweat. That combination made him predictable in the best way. Put Homer in any situation, from working a second job as a night watchman to going into space, and you knew exactly how he'd respond, even if the specific punchline caught you off guard. Bart, on the other hand, wasn't just the bad kid. He was a pint-sized anarchist with a code, someone whose rebellion was always fueled by an instinctive distrust of authority. Lisa wasn't just the smart one. She was an intellectual trapped in a town of lovable morons. Her brilliance both her gift and her curse, and her emotional arcs hit harder because she knew she was isolated. Even the secondary characters, Moe, Skinner, Krusty, and Marge's sisters, had rock-solid internal logic that made them feel like real people in cartoon skin. And here's the beautiful irony. This consistency didn't limit the comedy, it supercharged it. When Homer messed up, you laughed not because it was random, but because it made perfect sense for him. When Lisa lost faith in humanity for the 50th time, you chuckled because of course she did. And of course she'd rebuild it by the end. This is why the humor of those early seasons felt organic, alive and smart without feeling smug. But here's the warning sign that nobody saw coming. Once you start letting characters behave in ways that ignore their core traits, the whole system collapses. Change Lisa from a skeptical outsider to a trend-chasing activist, and suddenly she's not Lisa anymore. She's a plot device. Turn Moe from a seedy, borderline criminal bar owner into a lovesick puppy who occasionally says the wrong thing and you've sanded off his comedic edge. And don't even get me started on jerk-ass Homer, the modern version who acts like a wacky, indestructible cartoon dad with no rhyme or reason. A man who will leap into any situation not because it makes sense for him but because the writers need a quick gag. The second you lose that internal logic, the laughs lose their punch. Because now you're not laughing at a person you know, you're laughing at noise. And that's the slippery slope that eventually greased the wheels for Zombie Simpsons. But before we dive into how the cracks started forming, let's talk about the episodes where this perfect marriage of character integrity and narrative craftsmanship reached its peak. Stories so sharp and emotionally resonant they could have been bottled and sold as Golden Age Simpsons. Now, if you want to understand just how invincible The Simpsons once was, you have to look at its greatest hits, episodes so perfectly balanced between comedy, heart, and razor-sharp social commentary that even the DVD commentary tracks feel like masterclasses in storytelling. Take Lisa on Ice, for example, a sports episode on the surface, but underneath it's a deeply relatable sibling rivalry wrapped in slapstick hockey violence, culminating in a moment so sweet it could have been written by a Hallmark card. If Hallmark cards were allowed to show Lisa high-sticking her brother, or Who Shot Mr. Burns, a season-spanning cliffhanger that was The Simpsons' answer to Dallas's Who Shot J.R. Except in Springfield, the drama came with a healthy dose of absurdity. Red herrings and a town hall meeting where Moe suggests tying up loose ends in a way that should have gotten the censors twitching. And let's not forget Last Exit to Springfield, the labor union satire that somehow managed to lampoon corporate greed, labor strikes, and dental plans, all while delivering one of the most quotable lines in the show's history. Lisa needs braces, dental plan. Lisa needs braces, dental plan. That loop has been living rent-free in my brain since 1993. These episodes worked not just because they were funny, but because they had something to say. Whether the topic was the soul-crushing reality of corporate America, the inevitability of mortality, or the subtle hypocrisies of small-town politics. The early Simpsons managed to package biting satire inside plots that could still make an 8-year-old laugh, and more importantly, rewatch. And the thing about these episodes is that they could go surreal without losing their footing. Homer could go to space, sure, but the emotional core, his desire to prove himself, still made it believable. Bart could sell his soul, but the resolution still gave you something to feel. They could make you laugh until your face hurt and still sneak in a moment that made you think, wow, that's actually kind of beautiful. It's this fusion of brain, heart, and humor that made those seasons bulletproof. But here's where the hook sinks in. All of that was about to shift. Not with an explosion, but with a quiet pivot in tone that began in season 8. That's the season where the narrative gravity started to loosen just enough for absurdity to float to the top, setting the stage for plot lines that were less sharp satire and more Homer is a heavyweight boxer now. And while those episodes were still funny, they carried the DNA of a change that would eventually mutate into the zombie Simpsons we know today. Now, every great empire has its turning point. Rome had the assassination of Julius Caesar, the Beatles had the day Yoko allegedly showed up to rehearsal, and The Simpsons had the principal and the pauper. But before we drop into that moment, we need to rewind just a hair to season 8, because this is where the show started loosening its narrative seatbelt. We still had greatness. In fact, Homer's Enemy, the story of Frank Grimes, is the highest-rated episode in the show's history and a brilliant commentary on how absurd Springfield life really is. But alongside those classics came a wave of increasingly bizarre premises. Homer becomes a heavyweight boxer, Bart works at a burlesque house, Marge tangles with the Italian mob and Japanese yakuza, and the family hires a magical British nanny. Don't get me wrong, these episodes are still good, some are even fantastic, but they're inching away from grounded satire and toward full-blown absurdism. And then in season 9 it happened. The Principal and the Pauper. If you've never seen it, buckle up, because this is the television equivalent of taking a character you've known for years, tossing their entire history in the shredder, and saying, we'll just write something else. In one 22-minute swoop, we learned that Seymour Skinner, the rigid, rule-obsessed, hilariously repressed foil to Bart Simpson, was never actually Seymour Skinner at all, but a guy named Armin Tamzarian, a street punk from Capital City who stole Skinner's identity after the real one went missing in Vietnam. Everything we knew about his upbringing, his relationship with his mother, the reasons behind his borderline military discipline, gone. And for what? A cheap gag that ultimately goes nowhere, ends with everyone pretending it never happened, and leaves the audience wondering why they just watched an episode where the writers essentially told them none of this mattered, thanks for your time. The problem wasn't that The Simpsons had never broken reality before. They had, but in the past, even the weirdest episodes still respected the integrity of the characters. Here, the writers took one of their best secondary characters and dismantled him in front of the audience for the sake of a one-off plotline. Fans noticed, critics noticed. Even cast members have voiced discomfort about the episode over the years. If it had been a one-time slip, maybe history would have been kinder. But instead it was a preview of things to come. More character rewrites, more absurdist detours that weren't anchored in satire, and a slow erosion of the internal logic that had made Springfield such a believable if ridiculous place. If you want to know why The Simpsons changed, don't just watch the episodes. Follow the names in the credits, because by the time we hit the late 90s, the people who built the golden age had started vanishing faster than Sideshow Bob after a failed murder attempt. First, the Holy Trinity. Matt Groening moved on to other projects like Futurama. Sam Simon had already left back in '93 after creative differences, and James L. Brooks stepped back around 1995, following a public dispute over the crossover episode A Star is Burns. That alone would have been a seismic shift, but it didn't stop there. The writing staff, the very architects of Springfield's layered humor, began to thin out season after season, with a massive exodus hitting right around season 8, exactly when the quality graph starts its slow but steady nosedive. By season 12, only a tiny fraction of the original brain trust was left. And while the new writers weren't untalented, far from it, they were inheriting a tone, a structure, and a legacy that couldn't be replicated without the original mix of rebellion, precision, and emotional grounding. The result? A slow but noticeable change in the comedy style. Gone were the 30-40 rewrites that turned every gag into a multi-layered gem. In their place were simpler, more obvious jokes, the kind that would have fit neatly in a show with a laugh track. Take the example broken down by Jonathan Jason in 2016. In a modern episode, Homer hears an airport boarding call for women, children, and fat men, and shouts, "That's me." End of joke. No subtext, no character revelation, no satirical edge, just a self-referential throwaway. Now rewrite it in the classic style, same announcement. Homer ignores it. An employee taps him on the shoulder, gestures toward a queue of overweight men, and Homer sighs. Suddenly the joke tells us about Homer's obliviousness, the airport's efficiency, and society's attitude toward obesity. 3 laughs for the price of 1. And here's where the term jerk-ass Homer starts rearing its ugly, beer-stained head. Here's the thing about The Simpsons. It was born with a chip on its shoulder and a slingshot aimed squarely at pop culture's bloated face. In the early years, the show mocked TV tropes, skewered Hollywood's ego, and took celebrities down a peg with parody characters. Rainier Wolfcastle for Arnold Schwarzenegger, Troy McClure for the vapid charm of B-list fame. Never letting the target off easy. But somewhere in the early 2000s, that slingshot got traded for a selfie stick. Instead of creating original characters to satirize famous people, the writers started inviting the real celebrities to play themselves, and the joke became, well, just having them there. In classic Simpsons, the humor came from the way Springfield warped celebrity culture. In modern Simpsons, it felt like Springfield was rolling out the red carpet. "Welcome to the United Kingdom," says Tony Blair, "because apparently we're doing tourist ads now." "Hey, it's Blink 182. Thanks for the lift, Tony Hawk." Because nothing says biting satire like casually name-dropping skateboarding royalty without a punchline. And this is the fatal irony. The show that once obliterated the shallow worship of fame was now guilty of it. Without an obvious cultural villain, the show turned inward, and not in a clever, self-aware way. Episodes became self-referential, leaning on meta-humor and remember when gags instead of targeting the world outside. The rebellion that fueled the show's original voice was gone, replaced with a kind of complacent self-parody, and when a satire stops satirizing, it becomes the very thing it was making fun of. And now, dear viewers, we arrive at the part of our story where the metaphor stops being metaphor and starts being a coroner's report. This is the zombie Simpsons era. The period where the body of the show kept walking, talking, and churning out episodes. But the spirit that once made it a cultural lightning strike had long since slipped out the back door of Moe's Tavern. By the time we reached the early 2000s, everything we've talked about, the staff exodus, the shift from layered satire to easy gags, the character flattening, the celebrity worship had calcified into the show's new normal. Storylines leaned hard into the absurd without anchoring them in satire or emotional truth. The writing, once as sharp as a crusty burger patty, is questionable, now often played like a checklist of what wacky thing can we make Homer do this week. The social commentary that once gave episodes their bite was dulled into broad, inoffensive humor designed to keep the gears turning rather than start conversations. By season 28, it hit its lowest point in series history, the pop culture equivalent of watching the Mona Lisa get repainted with googly eyes. The tragedy isn't just that the show changed, it's that it became the very kind of generic laugh-track-ready sitcom it was created to destroy. Except now animated and self-aware enough to occasionally wink at the audience about it. And yet, here's the kicker. Despite everything, there's a weird comfort in knowing The Simpsons is still out there. Like an old friend you don't hang out with much anymore but are oddly reassured to know is still alive. And that, folks, is the story of how one of the greatest shows in television history went from kicking down the doors of the status quo to occasionally locking itself out of its own house. From satire that made presidents squirm to celebrity cameos that made us yawn, from layered character studies to jerk-ass Homer pratfalls. This was the fall of The Simpsons. But hey, just because Springfield's glory days are over, doesn't mean our deep dives into TV legends have to be. If you enjoyed this breakdown, smash that subscribe button like Homer smashing a pie at the county fair, ring the bell so you never miss another episode of our pop culture autopsies, and drop your favorite Simpsons moment in the comments. I read them all, even the ones from Comic Book Guy. And don't go anywhere, because up next we've got another investigation that'll have you questioning everything you thought you knew about a different TV classic. And trust me, you won't want to miss the scandal hiding in plain sight.